Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. Since today is the 13th, add the 13th floor to your list of cybersecurity movies. It came out the same year as The Matrix, and both deal as simulations as a stylish menace, born of green fonts off a black screen. The 13th floor was even based on a sci-fi novel from the 60s, which posited the use of simulectronics for marketing research. Of course, neither captured the actual reality of virtual reality like the metaverse. After all, the movies embellished things like dying while connected and avatars having legs. Which means this week we chat with Josh Grossman about the OWASP ASVS project, what to expect in version 5, and what it's like to run an OWASP project. In the news segment, Loom provides transparency, GitHub requires 2FA, flaws in reference code, notes on a career ladder, and more. Jack in and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the zero-noise application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Invicti, AppSec with zero noise. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. This is episode 232, recorded March 13th, 2023. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Howdy. I'm fighting off a cold while I'll try not to sneeze on you over the internet.
Oh dear, no sneezes, no colds. Hope you're feeling better by the end of the interview, because we got some fun stuff to talk about. We're also here with Akira Brand. Akira, what are you fighting off today?
Oh, the hordes of darkness and evil, clearly.
Excellent answer. I should have just known that. That's what you do every week. Thank you for joining us. If you're all for listeners, if you're interested in joining some hordes of darkness and evil, join us at an upcoming official cybersecurity summit in a city near you. This series of one-day, invitation-only executive-level conferences are designed to educate senior cyber professionals on the latest threat landscape. We are pleased to offer our listeners $100 off admission when you register with the code SECWEEK23. Visit securityweekly.com/cybersecurity summit to learn more and register today. Josh Grossman has worked as a consultant in IT and application security and risk for 15 years now, as well as a software developer. He is currently CTO for Bounce Security, where he helps clients improve and get better value from their AppSec processes and provides specialist AppSec advice. His consultancy work has led him to work, speak, and deliver training, both locally and worldwide, including privately for ISACA and Manicode and publicly for OWASP's global AppSec conferences. In his spare time, he co-leads the OWASP ASVS project and is on the OWASP Israel chapter board. Hello, Josh. Thank you for joining us.
Hi there. Really great to be here. Thanks for having me today.
We want to talk about all the spare time you have, the OWASP ASVS project. By no means a small project, and it's been in version 4 for a few years now, but version 5 is coming. So we do want to find out about version 5, but first, maybe tell us a little bit about the ASVS in general and how you came to get involved with it.
Yeah, so the ASVS is, I think, a really interesting project. I mean, I'm a little bit biased, but it's certainly, I think, really, really important for the overall goal of securing software. I mean, everyone's heard of the OWASP Top 10. Everyone knows about the OWASP Top 10 Risks project. And that's a great project for building, I guess, awareness about application security issues. But it's sort of a top 10 list. It's sort of 10 items. It's sort of also not 10 items if you dig into it. And it's also sort of bringing problems. It's saying, here are 10 things you should worry about. Here are 10 problems you're going to have to figure out how to deal with. I guess the ASVS takes a slightly different approach. The ASVS is the Application Security Verification Standard. And the idea is that it brings guidance on how to actually do security properly, how to build security into applications, what sort of things you should be dealing with. And the idea is it tries to take a comprehensive view of that. It tries to say, okay, well, in this category, here are the requirements you want to build into the application in sort of a positive way. Verify that it's doing this, verify that it's doing that. And again, by having this sort of comprehensive view and having this, I guess, structured sort of as a standard, and also having the positive aspect, I think it's much more valuable for developers. But as you say, it is quite large. There are quite a lot of requirements.
There are indeed, and it does cover. There's obviously overlap too. If the OWASP Top 10 is pointing out the problems that, honestly, the same problems we've had since the beginning of the web, ASVS is likely pointing out here, as you said, it's a bit more prescriptive. It's a bit more guidance about what should we do about logging, authentication, input validation, and so on. With that said, I was joking a little bit about the OWASP Top 10 being pretty much the same in spirit for 20 years. We still have cross-site scripting, still have SQL injection. So how come the OWASP ASVS hasn't fixed that in version 4? What are you going to fix with version 5 so everything becomes secure magically?
So I guess the biggest challenge of the ASVS is the size. I mean, there are some ways in which it's easier to approach it. So it's got 3 levels whereby you can start off with level 1, which has, it's talking about 100 requirements, but the idea is, okay, you can start with level 1, look at these 100 requirements, square those all away, and then move on to level 2. But even that's quite a big chunk of time, a big investment. So I think one of the key goals for version 5 is to try and improve the usability, try and reduce the overall barrier to entry, and just make it easier for organizations to start using this. I mean, I think that's a simple answer. It's very large, it's quite hard to use, you can't just take it and start using it. It's something you need to work on gradually, and that's what I'm spending quite a lot of my time on as well at the moment, is finding ways to provide advice about, okay, well, how can we focus this for a particular situation or for a particular feature or for a particular organization? How can the organization take this and put it into bite-sized chunks to actually use it? And that's what I've also given a couple of talks about recently, trying to use it to build a sustainable process that's not so large that everyone just falls over in horror every time they see it.
That's interesting, because it sounds like a major part of the rewrite or revamp, let me just say version update, is focused on maybe the clarity of requirements or how you're giving the guidance, as opposed to we just need a ton of new and different guidance. Tell us a bit more about that, about how, basically it sounds like part of it or a major part is a communication challenge.
Yeah, I think maybe this speaks to a wider question, but I think often as security people, we may have a inclination sort of into talking security jargon or talking things that security people may be very familiar with. But if we really want this to work, if we really want it to actually get picked up and sort of actioned on a regular basis, we need to make sure it's clear to someone who's not necessarily a full-time security person, but rather someone, a developer, someone who's actually working there on the ground, trying to build the software and just wants some idea, okay, what do I need to do about this? And I think part of that is about making the requirements themselves slightly more clear, making them slightly more accessible. I think also part of it is educating organizations about how to use it within their own organization. We don't just say, look, take this, it's this generic document, and that will, that's it. It's about taking the document, and we recommend even forking it for your own use, taking your own copy and start making your own specific, adding your own specific guidance, making your own specific changes. Okay, we don't use this technology, so these requirements are never going to be relevant to us, so let's take them out so developers aren't scratching their heads over them. We have specific solutions for these particular requirements. Maybe within an organization, okay, we have a library that does this for you. We don't need to get bogged down, well, how do I do this? We can just put, okay, here's a requirement, here's the internal library of how to actually use it, and how to actually make sure this happens within the application. And so the idea is to use the ASVS as the basis, but also build around it customization and specific guidance for that particular organization.
Yeah, very much. And to my mind, it sounds like it's much easier to build a secure SDLC program around the ASVS than around the top 10. And even to its credit, the OWASP Top 10 has said, in the recent version, here's how to build up or think about the OWASP Top 10 as the seed of a program. But a lot of people early on, I think, just said, oh, we're top 10 compliant, or we have an OWASP Top 10 program. And I think that, the project leaders probably are cringing a little bit at that. It's sort of a misunderstanding. What are some ways then from the ASVS perspective to get ahead of that, to say, here's either how to use it within a maturity model I think you've been alluding to, or where does it fit within that secure SDLC?
So, if I think about it in terms of OWASP projects, I guess the OWASP Top 10 is the project that demonstrates we need secure SDLC, that we need to build security into our processes. It doesn't necessarily say how to do that. It just says, look, this is a problem that needs fixing. Sort of at the management level, we need to be thinking about this. There's actually another project in OWASP called OpenSAM, the Software Assurance Maturity Model, which it speaks more to about the different sort of security activities you might want to build into an SDLC. So that's quite a good basis of saying, okay, what do we actually want to do? How are we doing right now? How do we want to level up overall activities? And then where the ASVS comes in is saying, well, look, we know we need to think about security at the requirement stage. So we can use the ASVS as a basis for, here are some security requirements for this stage. Here are some things we need to consider alongside the performance requirements and the functional requirements and the user interface requirements. Here are some security requirements we can take into account. And then that can continue through latter stages as well. If we're giving specific guidance on how to do something, then developers might be using that during the implementation stage. If we have QA that we want to be looking at particular security aspects, and again, they can refer to that and say, well, is this happening? Is that happening? Now, hopefully that's already linked through because once we have security requirements, hopefully now have requirements that QA can test against. But either way, the idea is to use it as a tool, use it as something that can assist with these sort of security activities as we carry on throughout the development process.
And it is, I've found it a very helpful tool as well for for what it covers. And as I mentioned, like the input validation, encoding, logging is another big one that I'll keep coming back to. But it also there's also an aspect that the web is still HTML, HTTP, JavaScript. Are there other as you dive into ASVS or you get feedback, are there particular new areas that you're also pulling into this to say here's the new fun thing? Here's how to design, implement it.
Yeah, so we're certainly having some interesting discussions about what needs to be added. I think one big area that we sort of called for some suggestions about is WebAssembly, which seems to be becoming a little bit more widespread, although interestingly, cool. WebAssembly seems to be growing outside of the web as well as outside of the browser, based on a recent presentation I saw about it. But it does seem to be something that we're going to see more use of, and it'd be nice to have some guidance around that. Another big area is the sort of OIDC and OAuth space. Where there is some sort of discussion of that in version 4, but it's not super specific, and we're trying to look at how we can provide some slightly more specific guidance for that, whilst not absolutely drowning in the complexity of the overall ecosystem that we have there. That's an ongoing discussion as well. So we're certainly trying to make sure we bring in new areas. Ultimately, the idea is we know we can only do a big refresh on this project every few years, and therefore it's important as we're gathering together a new version that we're looking ahead and thinking, okay, what's going to be important not just now, but in the future as well. And there are interesting examples in that in version 4, and like I say, we're looking at new areas for version 5 as well.
Part of that is you're talking about the new areas, and much of the ASVS is very squarely focused on the developers. Here's what developers do, developer feedback. I think you've also gone out and actually, surprise, talked to developers, presented to developers, rather than just talking about the ASVS to AppSec folks. Tell us more about that. Why would we bother talking to developers about security?
Well, this is a realization I came to, and we spend a lot of time in security talking about security and going to security conferences and sort of getting very caught up in the latest security thing. But especially in application security, the developers are sort of where we need to be. The development organizations are where we need to be. And I think that we've sort of gone in a situation where application security is seen as a specialism, it's seen as this group. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's a team, sometimes it's a function that's within the organization, but it's sort of seen as a separate thing. And we have to find ways of sort of closing that gap and saying, well, actually, we need to be working within the development organizations. We need to be sitting alongside developers. We need to be reporting on progress and on issues, not to security leadership but to development leadership, and we have to make them want to actually be interested in this and make them do this. I think that for a lot of time I've seen this in lots of different environments. There's this sort of anti-pattern of there's a security team and they come up with a cool idea and they go to development leadership, and development leadership are like, well, that's a really cool idea, you should get right on that, you should go and do that. And then the security team start going to individual developers and saying, oh, we'd like you to do this. This is a real example I've seen. Security training had a relatively mature organization that got some nice interactive developer security training. And this is exactly what happened. They got the leadership said, yeah, that sounds great. They started going to individual developers saying, have you done your security training? And they said, well, I've got this on, I've got this to build, and I've got this feature to finish, and I'm in the middle of this sprint, I've got this task. And it wasn't something that was built into their day. It was something the security team were almost expecting they sort of do in their spare time or in their free time that they obviously had copious amounts of during their work day. And it's not something that works. And it's on the one hand, it's not going to get the security activities actually done. On the other hand, it's going to get developers resenting the security function as providing them extra work and giving them extra problems. And a lot of what I'm working on at the moment, what I'm thinking about is how can we reduce that workload? How can we make that easier? And how can we sort of merge those two things together? So AppSec isn't its own thing on the side, but rather, the development organization, the development group makes a decision, okay, we want to build in a secure way. How are we going to do that? What are we going to include? And security activities and security tasks to become another part of the developer's day-to-day that's planned and allocated in time. If they're going to a sprint meeting and they're getting a bunch of tasks to do during a sprint meeting, one of those tasks is a security task, and it's built into the plan that's part of their work day, and they've got time allocated to do it. So I've been going to various developer conferences recently and generally trying to be more engaged with developers, and I think they're certainly very open to this sort of thing. They're very, they want to build things securely, but if we talk about the idea, okay, well, security is everyone's job. Security is not everyone's job. Everyone's job is what their manager says it is, and we have to put it into their job, and we have to have it included as part of their job if we want it actually to get taken seriously, if we want it to succeed. I don't think it's going to happen just coming from the side as security people.
No, indeed. I think I'm curious. I love the fact that you've gone to developer conferences and spoken with them. I'm curious. You gave us a little bit of insight on what it takes to have those conversations with developers, where their priorities are, how to, what points to hit. But I'm curious to lean into that a bit more and tell us, when you give a presentation at a developer conference, what do you do differently than from the presentation you might give at the OWASP conference, for example, or just an AppSec conference?
So I guess two key aspects. I think the first key aspect is, obviously you have to understand that the audience is different, the level, the backgrounds, knowledge is different. Not all of them will have heard of OWASP. I sometimes do a quick show of hands at the beginning. Okay, who's heard of OWASP? Who's heard of the ASVS? Who's heard of the OWASP Top 10? Just to try and gauge, okay, well, what's the personas of people in the room? If you can go to an OWASP conference, everyone's heard of OWASP, but you can't necessarily take that for granted, and you need to make sure that when you're talking about terminology, you're making it clear to them. So I think that's the first aspect of making sure it's at their level of knowledge and it's focused on making sure they understand the concepts you're talking about. I think the other part is you need to be very careful about how you talk about things and how you talk about what you want to happen or what you want them to do, because you have to appreciate, well, we need to meet them where they are. We need to be able to put this into their overall, what they're used to, their overall day-to-day. We can't start saying, well, you need to start doing this task, you need to start doing that task, and why aren't you using this resource or that resource? Because you have to be very open to the fact that this is going to be both new to them and something that is going to have to fit into their overall worldview. I think it's sort of different approach, and it has to be very sort of collaborative and engaging approach, and saying, look, I'm not trying to bring you problems, I'm not trying to bring you extra work, I'm not trying to bring you stress, I'm trying to help you, I'm trying to bring this to as in a way that makes it easier for you. Again, another classic anti-pattern is sort of the antagonist security person, the Department of No, and it's about completely shedding that image and being very, very, very open. And I think that we have I think that's the Department of No. A stereotype I think is quite well known, but I think not being the Department of No is almost not enough. You have to be extra engaging, you have to be extra involved with them, and reaching out to them more proactively. They have to be excited to see you, they have to be happy to see you, and I think that's quite a challenge, especially some security people tend to be a little bit cynical, but I think it's vital to sort of get that positive engagement going.
Josh, I have a question for you. You pointed to earlier that developers' work is not necessarily what the developer wants to do, it's what the manager tells them to do. So how do you get engineering managers on your side when you are trying to get developers to do security?
So I think the key thing is you have to start with the engineering managers. You can't start with the developers. And I think so sometimes maybe it's a terminology thing, or maybe it's just the way I talk about it, but ultimately this has to start at the top. This has to be a decision that's made at the senior levels of engineering to say, look, if we want, we would like this activity to happen, but this activity needs to become, you need to be able to take responsibility for this activity and include it in your day-to-day, otherwise it's just not going to happen. I mean, I'm working with an organisation at the moment, we're looking at the RACI matrix, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, and I'm sort of saying to them, look, we've got this Racky matrix. Security sits in the C. Security sits as consulted. If we want this to happen, then the engineering have to be both accountable and responsible for actually doing it on the ground. And security has to find a way of making that easier and providing them with the resources and helping them along with it, and potentially holding their hand on the initial stages. But if we really want it to be bedded in, if we really want it to be sustainable, then engineering management has to say, okay, this is now becoming part of our standard process. And I don't think engineering organizations are, I don't think this is a thing that's foreign to our engineering organizations. Very frequently they'll have specific processes around software development. They'll have their agile processes, they'll have their scrum meetings, they'll have their design meetings, they'll have their release meetings, depending on the type of organization. These are, they're used to having specific processes and some element of formality in place. It's just figuring out, okay, how's that going to, security has to figure out how's that going to work in this case, but then engineering have to take responsibility for actually saying, look, we're going to pick this up and we're going to run with it and we're going to use it.
Yeah, and I greatly appreciate you pointing out that the C is for consulted, not cynical. And AppSec is part of the Racky matrix. And as you pointed out too, it needs to have active participation, that you can't passively just sit back and say, well, come to me when you have a problem, or I'm going to wait until something, some breach happens, then I'll come out with the I told you so, and we'll take advantage of that and instill a whole bunch of new processes. Kind of shifting a bit though into that management theme, however, you're managing a project like ASVS. You're co-lead curating this project. What's it like to wrangle? Speaking of InfoSec groups who are perhaps cynical, they also might have highly opinionated or strongly held opinions. How do you wrangle some of that into building on a new version of the ASVS?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge there. We've got 5 co-leaders of the project, all from sort of different backgrounds, very much geographically spread as well, sort of different perspectives, and we generally manage to come to some sort of conclusion, some sort of agreement, but we don't just want it to be us, and we take a lot of feedback from GitHub issues and feedback that comes directly to us, and there's a lot of input that comes in that way. It's about trying to balance between the different perspectives and then figure out, okay, well, what's going to work best for us? What's going to work best for the overall user base of this standard? And certainly I think trying to encourage that input is vital, because we obviously see certain aspects, we see certain perspectives, we want to see a wide variety of perspectives as well. But there's certainly a lot of effort involved in actually bringing that to some sort of conclusion, bringing that to some sort of consensus. And I think it's a challenge. It's a lot of work. This is why we can only do this every few years, and this is why when we do want to do it, it's a lot of work. We're not necessarily at rewrite stage yet. At the moment, we're still at the stage of going through hundreds of GitHub issues to figure out, okay, well, where are we on certain points? Where are we on certain requirements? And in some ways, that's half the battle. I spent some time a month or so ago working down the GitHub issues. I think I got to 100. I think last time I checked, they're now 130 again, because it's great to get input. We need that input, and that only makes the standard better. But it's certainly time consuming. And I think that sort of feeds into sort of overall discussions that are happening in OWASP at the moment about sort of how OWASP is maintains itself, how OWASP is sustainable. It's certainly compared to other industry groups, it's relatively a relatively low budget and relatively low finance available in order to actually push this sort of thing along. And there's a lot of discussions at the moment thinking about how we can actually increase that budget, how we can get more support from the organizations that are using these projects and are benefiting these projects, in order to make sure that we keep these projects going and that we can keep them sustainable. Some projects are well funded and are well supported, others less so. Certainly ASVS doesn't have an official supporter or an official main sponsor. It's certainly got our organizations. Some organizations let us spend some time on organizational time to work on it, and we have had some support here and there, but it's a challenge. It's something that all of OWASP is looking at the moment, and I think ASVS is part of that as well.
Yeah, indeed. And I want to come back to the idea of what the community can do to help and collaborate and contribute, but let's touch on that, perhaps, third rail, the fun topic of OWASP for a moment, about what is, ASVS is a well-known project. I'm not sure if it officially counts as flagship or not. That's just my ignorance. I forgot to check. But, what would be the type of thing that would help you from OWASP, or help you from that organizational support to manage a project like this? Sort of what's a good future that you would see from the org?
I think that there's tension between the idea of OWASP historically being a volunteer-led organization, but also the level of reliance that's now placed on OWASP. I mean, OWASP Top 10 is considered a de facto standard. I hate using the word standard, the OWASP Top 10, but ultimately it's mentioned in all sorts of contexts. We're certainly seeing more use of ASVS, all sorts of other use of OWASP in a semi-commercial sense. And I think OWASP has to find ways of trying to bring that back to the actual organization and bring more funds into the organization from these corporations who are using it, from the organizations that are using it, while still making it accessible to the individual people and the end users, but also not being in a situation where OWASP is being controlled by the corporations. There's discussion about there are other organizations where you can effectively the highest paid, highest level of sponsorship gets them a board seat and gets them control over the direction of the organization. I think that's something that's certainly not been the case in the past in OWASP and could potentially be a tricky thing to balance with the overall community aspect. So there's been lots of opinions aired about it at the moment, and I don't necessarily have an answer at the moment. I'm sort of in the middle of it, but I still need to figure out exactly what I think about it and where it comes down. But I think the overall goal needs to be to bring more of that support in. It's just a question of how.
Indeed. And it's great to hear your feedback, your insights on that as someone who's very directly working on one of these projects that would be impacted and doesn't have that similar funding. I'll mention, for example, OpenSSF. They clearly have lots of funding to put into security-minded efforts. Now, perhaps some of them are more focused on call it applied security in the sense of code reviews, et cetera, rather than setting up an ASVS. But clearly ASVS looks like something profitable in the sense of improving security to lean into, especially when you're taking it to developers, the audience that actually needs to hear this. So speaking of those audiences, what can AppSec folks do to contribute? So look at the other side of the coin. There's 130 issues at least to help triage. There's got to be more than just reading PRs as well, right?
Yeah, so we've got we certainly do want feedback on issues. We do want people to provide their opinions. Certain issues where we've specifically set out community wanted, because we want people to actually feed in and give their opinions on certain issues to help us decide which way to go on a particular requirement or how to address a particular requirement. And that's really important. There will also come a time once we've got a little bit further down the road where we've got an early draft of the version 5.0. We'll also be looking for people to go through that and provide feedback on the early draft and provide review. That's certainly a big area where people can actually take part and help out. There are also other sort of minor points around some of the way the documents are generated and some of the automation that maybe we could do with some help with as well. If people sort of don't fancy working on documents, but they do fancy writing a little bit of code or GitHub Actions, that could possibly help as well. But yeah, certainly the place to start is the GitHub repository or the ASVS channel in Slack. That's a great place to find out what we're currently talking about, what we're currently interested in.
One thing I'm thinking about, Josh, and Mike sort of got my brain going when he mentioned OpenSSF here. It's another project I'm working on. Thinking about open source, you're just talking about, I think when we've talked about ASVS in the past, and even now today, most of the time we're talking about, professional software developers using this, like in the result of a commercial product. Do you think at all about how would other open source projects go about using something like this? And from the standpoint and coming from one of the things I'm working with at CNCF is, how do we get all these projects which are coming through CNCF to actually have some form of security structure to them? Do we go out to all the sandbox projects? So I'm wondering, is this something you've thought about? How do, there's very few security folks in open source on the project side. Is this a tool that they could use, or have you seen someone use something like this?
So I guess the biggest challenge with ASVS, which I guess is size, and part of that then contributes to the actual, how do we check this? How do we verify this? How do we make sure this is the case? Certain requirements are a little bit more straightforward to automate, a little bit more straightforward to say, is this happening? Is this not happening? But a lot of it does require some manual involvement, and that's sort of tricky. That's a tricky nut to crack, because a lot of the requirements do need some sort of manual thought about them. They do need to say, okay, well, how have they actually implemented this? Have they done this in an appropriate way? If you're checking a security header, for example, that's very straightforward. You can see, okay, this web app returns a security header. We can check for that in an automated way. Job done. But if it's, well, have you implemented access control in an appropriate way, then that's a whole sort of kettle of fish that might require you to, potentially you can look at that from actually browsing the application, but you might need to look at the code as well. Like it's sort of difficult to streamline, difficult to automate. And I think that certainly a lot of the requirements are ultimately not specific to a particular industry or specific to a particular type of software. I think they're certainly usable by open source developers, but it's a question of, well, who's actually going to do that and how's that going to happen? The guidance is there. It's a question of actually thinking, well, how are we going to use this on the ground? And certainly for open source, that might be a challenge in the same way that getting any time to work on anything in open source is a challenge, in that someone needs to take the time to look at this.
Yeah, along those lines, I'm curious, how does an org, whether open source group or not, how would they demonstrate we followed the ASVS? And part of why I'm asking is that you could go in with pen testing and say, we didn't find anything. So, an ideal pen test report is an empty piece of paper in a way in terms of just what you didn't find. But that's also not necessarily helpful, because you also have to say, well, did you test for everything? Did you test for this part of the ASVS? Did you test for this? How did you test? Was it interesting? And I don't think the ASVS, in fact, is set up as focused on pen testing, which I think is good. There are other OWASP testing guides, et cetera. So I'm an engineering manager or I'm an open source team. How do I say, yeah, we followed the ASVS standard. Here's our little badge. How do I get my little badge on my GitHub repo?
So I think so in terms of using it for penetration testing, it's not set out in like how you do a test, physically what buttons do you click,
right?
The actual process. But I think it certainly is usable in terms of ideas. Okay, what do I want to check? What do I want to verify in a penetration test? So level 1 of the ASVS is intended to be almost entirely testable using penetration testing techniques. Someone who's coming from the outside and testing the application, like a regular user would use the application without necessarily inside knowledge. Mm-hmm. So I think it can be useful from that way. But I think the problem is we don't necessarily see penetration testing organizations using it. Certainly not on the face of the report. So I think it'd be nice to see more testing organizations actually going through and saying, well, this is what we checked. These requirements there are okay. These requirements there are issues. And certainly we're seeing initiatives to actually try and move that along. Most notably from Crest and their new OVS program, which looks at trying to deliver penetration tests, but with a sort of basis around the ASVS. And also Google are looking at this for the Application Defense Alliance project, which they are a part of, and they're using ASVS as the basis for some of the security testing around web-based applications. And so, those are two examples where organizations are trying to get to take the ASVS and use it, as it says, as a verification standard, as a way of saying, look, we're testing basing on this. We're not just sort of using some sort of nebulous pen testing methodology. We're actually basing specifically on that. And I think that organizations can development organizations, engineering teams can potentially try and self-certify. It is quite a lot of work, because they do need to go through it, they need to understand it, need to figure out how to do that. But I think we're certainly seeing more movement in the idea that the organization can come in, testing organization can come in and check you specifically against ASVS, and they feel you've got more comfort. Okay, I've not just gone through a pen test, I've actually been through some sort of test which verified me against these ASVS requirements, so I can demonstrate, okay, well, here I'm okay, here I'm less okay, but I'm working on it, and have slightly more comparable perspective, something you can actually take and show, look, here's how we're doing right now, here's how we're doing previously, and it's something a little bit less nebulous than here's a piece of paper with a bunch of issues that might or might not be complete from a pen test company.
No, yeah, thank you for that. And I definitely the OVS and even the App Defense Alliance, those were definitely areas newer to me that time to dive into and learn some more of. I'm curious too, it's learning as we, speaking of learning, the ASVS, working on version 5 coming out. Is there a particular section that you find most interesting? And interesting can be defined how you like it, in the sense of it's hard to do, it's complex, or it's an area where you see lots of risk and most mistakes. If someone had to pick one of the ASVS sections, what would that be?
It's funny. I think that. On the one hand, I sort of like the ASVS sections. They're a little bit more specific, a little bit more niche, and sort of problems that people don't necessarily always think about, but can still cause problems. So, for example, there's requirements talking about picking up on activities which are technically the user is allowed to do, but maybe not at the volume that they're doing it. So, for example, you've got a requirement that says, oh, well, if you've got let's say a call center system, I don't know, so let's say it's a bank's call center, and they're expected to look at, I don't know, 10 customers an hour or something like that, and they've got customers calling up and looking at their data. They're allowed to look at customer data as part of their job. And if they're looking at 10 customers an hour, then that's probably expected. If they're looking at 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 customers an hour, that probably means something untoward is going on. And they've not technically broken any access controls there because they're technically allowed to do it. But this is a sort of level of detail that ASVS can get into. It's like more subtle issues that can still be quite significant. So I think those type of issues I quite like, the idea that we can sort of pick up on some of the edge cases. But to me, the most exciting prospect for 5.0, the biggest thing is really, not a specific section. It's just about making it overall easier to use, to be, making it something that can more easily take to development teams and more easily show to development teams, and the developers can themselves access and feel more confident using. And to me, that's the big goal. We've publicly stated that our main aim for version 5 is usability, and to me, that's really, really important to actually bring the standard into development teams and get them using it and get it more widely used in the industry.
So one of the ways to improve usability, and for people that are curious, would be hearing you talk about it. What are some developer or AppSec conferences coming up that people you would like to highlight, or that people can come learn more about the ASVS?
So on ASVS, I've got a talk at QCon coming up in London in a couple of weeks' time now. That's late March in London, so that should be good fun. That's a talk more about building the ASVS in. QCon is more of a developer conference, so it's more about, okay, well, how do we actually take this and make it usable, make it practical? So that should be an interesting talk. I think I'm also speaking, doing a virtual talk for the OWASP Netherlands chapter, where I'll be talking a little bit more about version 5 and talking a little bit about the overall plans and some of this verification side as well, just to give a little bit more information about where we are and the direction that we're going in. Ultimately, for me, ASVS is about bringing security to developers, and that's the big goal for me. How we can make things easier for developers, and how we can make things make them feel more at home with it, and how we can get them integrated into their overall processes. Like I say, we don't want security to live with the security team. We want application security to live with the development teams.
And ASVS is a way to make that happen. So we love that. As we're wrapping up here, 5 has been kind of the theme number of the day, but we also always ask our guests to describe AppSec in 3 words. And as someone who's been working with the ASVS in particular, I'm very curious what your answer to that is.
So to me, when I think of AppSec in 3 words, it's, I've probably mentioned this already, development buy-in. We need that to be within development teams. It needs to be adopted by development teams. We can't just make this cool stuff that we think ourselves is really good if no one's going to use it and no one's going to take it up. And that's very much my focus, both on ASVS and other work I'm doing at the moment around application security tools, which is also a massive area. If we talk about 5-10 years ago, you said, okay, have you got an application security program? People would say, oh yeah, we do pen testing, we do application pen testing. And a few more years ago, you say, have you got an application security program? They go, yeah, we've got SAST, we've got DAST, we've got this tool, we've got that tool, we're running this in our CI/CD, and that's, I think that's part of the reason why developers may be a little bit frustrated with the security, and why I think we need that effort to actually go to them, because they've now seen the security as these tools which generally will give them a headache, will generally spit out a load of sort of nasty, complicated results if they've not got them tuned properly, if they've not got those tools actually configured in a way that developers can use them effectively, and that they'll again build into their processes and work with their processes. I think it's another classic coming at the side defense, where developers say, you come, the AppSec person comes to the development person and says, oh, I've got this 1,000 findings SaaS report. You just go through it and just get this sorted out by the end of the week, please. And it's another classic area of bringing this process. It doesn't work for developers and just gives them a headache and makes them not like security.
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure how many of those we could sort out just by the end of this week, even looking at the ASVS, because that's complicated enough as well. But you definitely sorted this out on lots of wonderful aspects and perspectives of talking to developers. I just keep coming to that because I love that as a theme, and I think that's something we don't talk about as much within AppSec circles. So thank you for bringing that perspective as well as the ASVS to us, Josh.
Yeah, I'm really glad to talk about it, and certainly I'm really keen for people to get in touch and talk about the ASVS. And I do training privately on the ASVS because I think it's a really interesting area, and I think it's really a high value area that can really help organizations structure how they look at security. And I also do training on about tools as well. And I think that's another area where I think there's a lot of value to be had, a lot of value to be found in these processes that don't necessarily come with the tool installation. You don't press next finish on the tool and suddenly get this value. I think you have to have some bit more understanding about how to actually get that value out. So those are my two passion areas at the moment: ASVS and AppSec scanning tools. Hoping to take the AppSec scanning tools training that I've got on that to Black Hat as well, which is really exciting.
Wonderful. Yeah. So yet another chance to go to Black Hat and attend some of Josh's training. We'll make sure we have a lot of links in the show notes so you can find what Josh has been working on, as well as presentations. So if you have some opinions on ASVS, if you have some time to go help out Josh. If you want to hear more from him, definitely attend one of his trainings or one of his presentations. So I want to say thanks once again, Josh. I want to say thank you to John and Akira. Thank you to all of our listeners. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week.
Thanks, everyone. Great chat to see you.